Today we are going to compare the scopes of flow reference and HTTP request. We use HTTP request to send requests to either intra or to applications within the same, to flows within the same application, or even to external APIs, like what we send from Postman. We use HTTP request to send requests from our from within our application. So we are going to see how the scopes of flow reference and HTTP requests are similar and how they are different. And also we are going to see how to pass dynamic query and URI parameters and headers to an HTTP request. You will understand this once we start doing the hands-on demo. So, and like last week, I'm trying to complete the projects in advance before the class and push the projects to GitHub, and also include a link to the Google Slides for the class on my blog. So it is good if you go in advance to my blog and practice, go over the slides, even if you don't understand it in full. If you try to reproduce the project, and if it fails somewhere, then when you come to class and when we do it together, you will understand why it failed. So that way you will understand it better. So this one also, it is on GitHub. You can get it from there, and its name is flow reference request scope. So since I have the steps to build the project on the Google Slides, you can reference to the Google Slides, and rather than spending time doing it together again, I mean, bringing the different components to Endpoint Studio and spending time on that, I think it is better if I spend time more explaining the concept, since I have already the project, the step-by-step, how to do it step-by-step on the Google Slides, and also the project itself on GitHub. So let me open my Endpoint Studio and show the project that I have. And in each stage, I show you what it is doing. Then you ask me if you have questions, and we go from there. So I will close other projects. I have also a couple of questions that we are going to see. Expect 1 or 2 certification questions related to the scopes of flow reference and HTTP requests. That's why I have no questions for that reason.
It's rare for to be on the radio, man. It's rare for to be on the radio. It's rare for to be on the...
Okay. So I'm opening it. So we have it here. First, what we are doing is we want to understand the scope of a flow reference. When we use flow reference, which part of the Mule event is accessible where is when we say scope, as we have been seeing from previous classes, when we say scope, a given payload, for example, where is it accessible? Or the variables, all the Mule events, we saw the Mule event structure, the different components of Mule event structure, where are they accessible and not? So that is what we mean when we say scope. So in here, the first, let me just show only this one. So in here, we have the main flow that you see, the upper main flow, and below it is a private flow. So private flow, to create private flow, we simply drag and drop flow, but we don't add a source trigger. So there is no source trigger in a private flow, but it has its own error handling. We said error handler, whereas in subflow, it has only processors. It doesn't have an error handler. There are differences that we saw from the previous classes. So in here, what we want to understand is, as the Mule event moves from one component to the other, how does the components of the Mule event change, is what we mean when we say scope. So let's add breakpointers, and we'll run it in debug mode and understand how it changes in each stage. and also I will show you the concept, I mean, what it is doing. So what I'm doing here is, so we want to compare flow reference and HTTP request actually. Otherwise, flow reference, we have seen it also, we have seen it in previous classes. So in here, in the upper flow, first in this component, we are reading JSON data, the airport is JSON data. And then we are creating a variable. So to the variable, we are just assigning, okay, this variable, let me remove it. I don't think we need it. Okay, so here we are creating a variable, and the variable in here is the MIME type of the payload, the data type of the payload. So which is this one in this case. So it is reading a JSON data type, because in here I explicitly told it the MIME type should be application/JSON. So I am saving that as a variable, and I'm calling it MIME type main flow. So from the main flow, because when we read data, the data that we read is a payload, right? So payload is the main component of a meal event that is processed. That is what we enrich, what we filter, and so on. So in here, we are reading data. We are creating a payload when we read the JSON data. And then we want to save the data type of the payload as a variable. So to do that, we use payload dot this caret sign media type. It shows, I'll show you how we can know how to, I mean, how I know how to get the data type using this one. When you run it in debug mode and see the meal components under the payload, there is this field there. So that is how I'm creating this variable. So we have payload in here because we are reading JSON data. Here we are creating a variable, and here I'm just printing to the console the payload, the data type of the payload, which is the data type of this JSON. And next, I am flow referencing. I'm using flow reference to reference to this flow. So what we want to understand is from the upper flow, which components of the meal event get transferred to the second flow. Does the variable get transferred? Does the payload get transferred? What about the other attributes? With flow reference, how does it look like? And when we use HTTP request, how is it similar and different is what we are looking at today. So in here, we are just printing to the console the data type or the MIME type of the payload. Here we are using flow reference. And as you can see in the flow reference, the flow name is flow reference private flow, which is the name of this one that you see, that's the second. So I'm referencing this private flow. And the other thing is, so I need the payload from this subflow. That is what I have here. And I am not specifying any target. If I specify a target from the previous classes, we said, if we specify a target here, if we give target name, then the data that comes from the private flow comes as a variable, not as a payload. But if we don't specify a target, then the payload will come into the main flow and overwrite the payload, the original payload. So the original payload in this case is JSON data. Whereas in here, in the private flow, I am transforming it to CSV. So it will be different structure, comma separated values. And the variable in this one, in the main flow, is JSON, because it is JSON is what I'm reading. However, in the private flow, since the JSON data, I'm transforming it to CSV, then this variable, the content of this variable should be now CSV. It has to be CSV. And this one, I can delete it for now. Okay, so let me add a breakpoint here. Oh, there is breakpoint already. Okay, so this is what we are doing. Let's run it in debug mode and then track how the components of the meal event change. So run in debug mode. Okay, until this gets deployed, if you have questions, I can take questions. You can unmute yourself and ask questions if you have any question.
Hello, sir.
Related to this flow reference. Other questions I will take at the end of the class, but what we are trying to understand here is what we are.
Can you hear me?
Are you talking to me?
Yes.
Yes, please go ahead. Yes, I can.
So yeah, I have a question. No,
Sure.
I'm just wondering what the carat is for in representing the media type. Is that how it should always be? I just wondering.
Yeah, I will show you here. Yeah, that is kind of it looks weird. Let me send a request and then I will show you from the Mule event. We will see it. You don't need to remember it. If you run it in debug mode, you can simply see it. So this has been deployed, and okay, now it has been deployed. I will send a request. So what we are trying to understand is I have the upper row, which is the main flow. I have the flow below it, which is a private flow. And there is a flow reference referencing the private flow. And what parts of the Mule event get transferred from the main flow to the subflow and vice versa is what we are trying to understand. So we can, to understand that, we run it in debug mode, add breakpointers as what we have been doing, and then track how the Mule event changes. So let me send a request, go to Postman and send the request, send, come here. So now we see, so focus on the upper rectangle. So the contents of the Mule event, we will see them here. And as it moves, as this rectangle moves, as I click on the top right, as I click the next processor, it will move from one component to the next component. And as it moves from one component to the next component, the Mule event content will change. So first, it has not yet run the read JSON data because it is just on that. So we don't see a payload. If I just click payload, there is no payload. If there is payload, when I click payload, I see its value on the rectangle on the top right. So there is no payload. Values is variable. Also, it's size 0. There are no variables, no payload, no variables. And attributes, I can see what the attributes are here. Basically, the path that the request was sent from. And if we we have also query parameters and so on, also it could get included here, but we are not interested in the attributes for now. So I will collapse them. So now focus on the contents of this Mule event as it moves to the next component. So I will click next component or F6, next processor, then it will move to the variable creation component. So now it is here. As you can see now, since it read data, one thing we have payload. The payload is the data itself. This data, you see it on the top right. That is our data, our payload. And as you can see, it is an array. So it is JSON data. The JSON data, the objects, it is array of objects. So you see one object, another object, another object. So JSON data, the regular JSON data, when it reads it in, it reads it like this. So we see it is like this. And to get the MIME type, if you simply expand this payload, click here, there is this media type. So this is how we are extracting it. There is this @ sign with caret media type. So if I come here and type payload dot, if I do like this, okay, payload media type and run it. So it extracts it. You see the data type, this content here, application / JSON and so on. So you don't need to remember it. I mean, I just want, this is for demo purpose, but if you want to get the data type anyway, of the payload, you can just run it in debug mode and see how to get it from the Mule event itself. So we don't yet have variable now, since since we have read in data, we have payload, but we don't have yet variables. That is why we see vars is 0. There are no variables. And then once we click next processor, since the set variable component will get executed, it will create a variable, which is the media type of the payload. So click next. Now we see there is vars has changed of size 1. The payload has not yet changed because we didn't alter it, we didn't modify it. But variable, we see one variable, and the variable name is what we just gave in here, which is the MIME type main flow. The MIME type main flow is a variable name, and its content is application JSON. So we want to see, does this variable get transferred to the private flow? And in the private flow, since our data type will be CSV, that CSV data type variable, does it come to the main flow is what we are trying to understand. It is raining. Okay, so now I'm just in the console. Let me clear this. It is good practice to clear the console when you have logger components, so that you can see what it logs, and it is good if you clear it for that reason. So clear here, and now I will click next processor, so it will log to the console. As you can see, it just, if we see here, the message here for the logger is the main flow payload MIME type is simply payload dot current media type. So it should print the main flow payload MIME type is application JSON. It should print that. So we can see in the console what it has printed. If you go here, scroll to the right, you see it here. So this is what the logger has. The logger, it printed this one. The main flow payload MIME type is application JSON. Okay, so now it is in the flow reference component. By the way, please pay attention. There are a couple of questions at the end that I will ask you, so related to this one. So there is, now it is on the flow reference. Once I click next, it will go to the private flow. So next processor, as you can see, it has come to the private flow. The payload, we see, let's see what has transferred to the private flow now. Everything, the whole meal event, it didn't change. The variables are accessible to the private flow, so there is a variable. The payload is there as is, it didn't change, everything. So what you have to remember is, under default settings, when we use a flow reference, the whole meal event of the calling flow is accessible in the flow that is being called, is what this is telling us. Okay, now, since I have the payload from the main flow, it is accessible in the subflow. It is originally as JSON data. Now I can transform it to CSV data. That's what we are doing here. So just I am telling it I need the data to be in CSV format. So now when I click next, you will see this, the rectangle, the content of the rectangle on the top right. From objects, it is going to change to comma separated values. So click next. Now let me show you the contents of the payload has changed. As you can see, there is comma separated values. This is what we open usually with CSV or with text editors, comma separated. So now this variable, this variable, it is going to, we are creating a variable. Okay, I will take questions once I go over this. So here I am creating a variable, and the variable is payload, the media type of the payload. In this case, it should be CSV because my payload is CSV. So when I click next, now if you see, we have two variables. One variable that came from the main flow, see here. One variable that came from the main flow, another variable that is part, we created it in the private flow. So in the main flow, the variable is application /JSON, whereas in the private flow, it is application /CSV. Now, when I click next, then everything from the private flow will return to the main flow. So what will happen is the variable name, since it is different variables, I will have two variables, whereas the payload, it will get overwritten. Since the payload from the private flow, in the flow reference, we are not saving it as a target. the payload will get overwritten. That means the JSON data, we are going to lose it. We will have only the CSV data. So you can understand why understanding the scope of different components is very important, because you may think you are, for example, combining data together, but you might have overwritten one payload while bringing in another payload. So while trying to join them, it may give you an error, or the data that it gives you could be incorrect. So understanding the scope is for that reason very important. So if I click next now it comes back to the main flow. As you see, our payload is just CSV. This is our final payload. And in the final logger, I am printing the MIME type of the final logger. It should tell me, it should say CSV. So clear the console first. Now, when I click next, then the flow has ended, and I will get result data in Postman, and that data will be the final payload, which is in this case the CSV data. So in Postman, I will expect CSV data, and this logger also to the console, it should tell that the MIME type or the media type of the payload is CSV. So click next. Now this is done, and you can see in here in the console, the data type is CSV, it says. And if I come to Postman also, as you can see, the data is not objectives, but rather comma-separated values. So in short, when we use flow reference, we want to compare it with HTTP request. When we use flow reference, everything under the default settings, everything from the main flow is accessible in the private flow or subflow, in the flow that is being called, and vice versa. Everything from the private flow is also accessible in the main flow, is what we see here. But there are a couple of 2 pointers here that we have. Before we go to HTTP request, I want to stress 2 pointers. Let me show you what they are. Okay. One is when we save the payload as a target. So in the flow reference itself, we can tell it to give us the payload as a target. In that case, it will be a variable. It will come as a variable. The other thing is, if we can also experiment with having the same variable name in the calling flow and in the flow that is being called too. The third last point that I want also to stress is, if we are saving the payload as a target, the variables that we create in the private flow or in the flow that is being called, they are not accessible in the main flow. Let's experiment these ones, and then I will take questions before we move to HTTP request. So here, what I said is, this one, the first thing is, in here, we can save the payload as a variable. We are giving it a name, some name. It could be anything. I can call it fish, or I can call it payload even. So since it is a variable, to access it, I will access it using vars.variable name. So let me give it, for example, payload. So this payload and this payload are different. This payload means just the payload data, whereas this payload means it is a name, a variable name, like x equals to 5. So the target, I'm giving it in name. Even not to confuse, I can also call it child payload. So now we are giving it a target name. If we give it a target name, what will happen? One thing is our payload will not be overwritten. Second thing is the payload from the private flow will come as a variable. Third thing is the variable from the flow reference will not be accessible in the main flow. So this one, let me stop it, and while it is running, I can take questions. Okay, did I save this? Save is here. Right click stop. Okay. Make sure it is saved. Yep. And also, by the way, even rather than doing later, also I can Yeah, okay. Let me just run this in debug mode. And I will take questions. Let's see who have raised their hands. Okay, I can take questions. Anyone who has questions? I see 3 hands.
Hello, Fish.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. In my project, just the debug is going good and it's deployed, but when I going through the process, instead of after the flow reference, instead of going to the private flow, it's going to back to the read JSON data.
Okay.
It's playing in the upper, not to the.
I see. Can you share your screen? Just it could be problem of others also. Let me stop sharing and share your screen.
Okay.
I have a question, Dr. Professor.
Okay, perfect. So can you click the listener? What do you have in the listener? What is the path for the listener? Double click it. Flow reference, main flow. Okay, perfect. And can you click the flow reference itself? Double click the flow reference component. I think you are referencing it back to the same flow. You see the flow name? The flow name on the under generic.
Yeah.
That one is the same as the calling flow. So it is calling itself.
Okay.
What do you have the name? What is the name of the other flow? The flow below it.
The flow name is private flow.
Yes.
Look.
Okay. Yeah. You want that.
Okay. I have tried this one.
Just in the drop down, in the flow name, the drop down under, there, on the right, there is on the right. You can click the drop down on the right itself, and then it will give you the list of available flows.
Drop down. Okay. Here.
Yes, that one. Perfect. Yes.
Okay.
The first one.
The first one.
Yep. Now it should work. Save it and stop it. Save it and debug it, and it should work.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Can you stop sharing? Okay. Henok, do you have a question? Okay. Fatawi?
Yes, can you go back to the project, Fish? And thank you.
Sure.
Yeah.
Share my screen. So you mean this,
yes.
right?
Yes, that is correct. Yeah, thank you so much. So my question is, I'm trying to understand why the payload is just getting overwritten when so you have the main flow and the sub flow, or the private flow, right?
Yes.
So when the payload is overwritten, but the variable is not, it's just what you have in the main flow and the private flow.
Because we gave it different variable names. If we give it the same variable name, this one, for example, if I give it just my var, you can experiment this. Give this my var. This one also my var. We have the same. Okay, my var. Let me make v uppercase. My var. This one also my var. Let me make this one default. Remove the saving it as target. So this one, if I debug it, now the variable, both the variable and the payload will get overwritten because I have the same variable names.
Yeah, I was just thinking maybe the two components have different characteristics. That's what I had in mind, but now it's just clear. Thanks so much.
Sure. Okay. Another question was from Abraham. Do you have a question?
I think the person who asked it right now was my question, similar question. So
Okay, perfect.
that's okay.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, this one we said if we have the same variable names, then the variable name will also get, or the variable content will also get overwritten. But if we have different variables, then the different, or we will have the content of all the variables. We can even quickly experiment with that, with this one. Let me, oh, okay, it is, okay, it is already running. Let me send and see if it works or if it needs rerunning it. Okay, see here, initially nothing is available. Then we have payload, but no variable yet. Now, if you see the name of the variable, it is my var, and it is JSON. Go next, it will get printed to the console, and it will come to the private flow. It is accessible. My var is accessible in the private flow. The payload is also accessible in the payload in the private flow. Now I'm creating another variable. I transformed the payload to CSV, so the payload changed. And also now when I click next, the content of the variable will get also changed. If you see now, my var has now changed to application CSV. Before, it was application JSON. What came from the main flow was application JSON, but now it is application CSV. So yeah, that is important point to remember. The variable name, if you have the same variable name, it gets overwritten. The payload also, if we don't save it as a target, it gets overwritten. Now let's experiment by saving the payload as a target, child payload. And the variable names, let's give them different variable names. Okay, I can call this my var1 from the main flow, or main flow var. And this one, private flow var. Okay, so now what did I say? If we save the payload, when we use flow reference, the content is of the flow that is referenced, if it is saved as a target, it doesn't overwrite our original payload, rather it will come as a variable. And the other thing is, the variable from the private flow will not come to the calling flow or to the main flow also. That's also another difference. Let's see that. So let me see if this updates. I hope it works. Okay, send a request again. Come here. We should be in debug mode. Oh, I didn't finish this. Okay, so it is here. Let me see what variable that is. Does it create? Okay, yes, main flow var. We have main flow var. So now we'll have two variables at the end. Let's see what they are. So I have main flow var. Okay, now I am on the flow reference. The flow reference is calling the private flow. From the private flow, it will get the payload as a variable. That is the only thing that it will get. It will not get, it will not get the variable from the private flow. So click next. Now I am on the private flow. Data transformed to CSV. See the payload changed. We are creating a variable. We have two variables, as you can see here, private flow var and the main flow var. Now I'll get back to the calling flow. So in the calling flow, our original JSON data, it didn't change. We have our original data here. So like, for example, this is advantageous if you want to join two data sources. Then one of it you have as a payload, the other of it you have as a variable. Now you can combine them. If you don't save one of them as a variable, when it comes, it will replace your original data. So you see, our original data in this case didn't change. It is in JSON. We see array of objects. And let's see the variables. What we have in the variables. We have the main flow var, which is this one, and also the payload from the private flow as CSV, as you can see. So this variable, it didn't come to the main flow. This one, this variable, the variable in the private flow, it doesn't come to the main flow. I think there is maybe a requirement that you can get only one variable from the flow that is being called, and that one variable, since the payload we are saving it as a variable, for that reason we don't get other variables from the private flow in the main flow. Does anyone have any question here?
Yeah. So what if you
I have a
more
question.
than two variables in the child flow?
If we have more variables in the child flow,
what would have happened to the number of variables that would get at the end if we had more than two variables that on the child flow? I don't think
we'll be able to access them. Since it gets only one variable, and that one variable is the payload as a target. We can experiment with this. You can just add another variable. Let's add set variable here and call it test var, and give it 100, for example. And this is in debug mode. Okay, exit from here. So we have set the variable. Now let's send another request. Let's see. Is this update? If you experiment more hands-on like this, you will understand it better, and that is how you master it. Remembering it could be difficult if you don't practice it. Okay. So now I come here. I send another request. Okay, maybe it is not working because I made a couple of significant changes. So if the changes are significant, if it was running, you have to stop it and rerun it. Run it in debug mode. Okay, until this gets deployed, let me talk about what we are going to see in the next part. So in the next part, we are going to see how to use HTTP request. So HTTP request. So listeners, it picks a request, whereas HTTP request sends a request. So,
I have a question, Dr.
Can I finish first and then we'll do it later?
Sure.
So HTTP request and HTTP listener. A listener listens a request and picks it up and sends a response, whereas in an HTTP request is like it sends a request. Like we are sending a request from Postman. Within an application, also you can send a request to flows in the same application or to external applications using HTTP request. So we are going to see how to use that. We will see sending an HTTP request to a flow within the same application, and also to an external application, to publicly available APIs. There are lots of publicly available APIs, and then you can experiment with them by sending requests, and if you can get back data in your application. So that way you integrate other applications, you learn integrating other applications within your application. So that is what we are going to see. But first, let's see this one. Now it is deployed, and we send a request. So what we are trying to do, what we are trying to understand here is if we have more than one variable. So we have initially we have this variable only, and it didn't come to the main flow when we use flow reference. Now, if we add another variable, what happens? So what I think is, if in the flow reference, the payload, if we save it as a target, that is only variable that comes to the main flow, is my understanding, but we can send a request and experiment with it. So send the request from here. It comes here, quickly run it. Comes here. You see, we have two variables which are private flow var, main flow var, because these are different variable names. So they will not, the variable names are different. Now I have the third variable, which is this one, test var 100. The test var 100, is it accessible in the main flow, is what we are experimenting. We know the payload will come as a variable called child payload. Now run this. So you see the same thing. So we have only the main flow var, which is this one, and the payload from the private flow also as child payload. That's this variable and this variable. Any other variables except the payload are not accessible to the main flow. Okay, let me go to the HTTP request demo, and then I will take questions at the end, I think, because we may run out of time, or we may continue on the same topic tomorrow. Okay, so in the HTTP request, I have a couple of projects with HTTP request. One is sending an HTTP request to a flow within the same application. You can see here. Another one is I have another one sending HTTP request to an external application that is even more interesting. And also I have a quiz with HTTP request. Probably we'll see that tomorrow. And we have also questions on the slides that we want to answer. So pay attention here with flow reference. We saw it before also. It was kind of review, but this one is new. So please pay attention here. If you are kind of somewhat tired, also try to drink coffee or water. So we have here, the only thing we changed here is in here, the flow reference, we replaced it by HTTP request. And also, I mean, in the paths, also there are different path names. This is get data request, whereas this one is get data flow reference. Okay, so the same thing, we are doing the same thing. We are reading JSON data here, creating a variable of the payload type here, printing to the console the data type of the payload here. In here, however, I want to spend a couple of minutes here. So you remember when we drag and drop a listener, we have to specify configuration here, connector configuration. If we don't have any connector configuration, we click add. In this case, since I can just click edit and show you this. We can use like either other port, we can accept the default configuration or even change them, the port and the read timeout and so on. The same thing with request also, we have to provide HTTP configuration. So the configuration, let me show you here, is I have host, port, these are the important ones. Base path is, if you have base path, you have to also specify base path. The host and port, see here. So what we are doing here is, this is our main flow in this case. We want to send a request to this flow. So this flow, the flow that is being requested, it is in my machine. So it is localhost. Where is it? Where is it? Its address is localhost. So you see here, if I show you here, I put here localhost. If this is an external application, I put the host address. It could be an IP address or another kind of address. Anyway, this is the address of the host. So in my case, it is localhost. And its port number, in the get here, since get, I specified 8081. I am saying this listener is going to listen at a port of 8081. So that is how I send a request. So in my request configuration, in here, in my request configuration, I'm telling it the host is localhost. It is my computer. It is within my computer, and the port is 8081. Then I have to tell it the paths, because I can have different applications in my computer with the same port and local host. So I have to give it if I have starting from base path, you see, we said this is optional. So I am not using it at all. We will see later, we will start using it when we have multiple applications. But for now, we don't have base paths, we just have paths. So once we provide the host and port, we click OK here, then the paths, we specify it here. Let me move this here to show you and move this up. So you see here, in here, the path, I'm telling it the path is read data. So, and that read data path is the path of this one, the path of the flow that I am requesting. If this path is different, then it will not work. So I'm like if we want to send a request to this flow from Postman, let me show you this one. If I want to send a request to this flow from Postman, how do I send it? I do, let me stop this. I do localhost 8081, then I provide the path, right? Like this, right? The same thing. So the request we are sending within the application, we are sending a request to this one. That is what it creates. So if you see here in the request configuration here, I gave it the host and the port, and I told it also the path, and it has created. As you can see, this is the address it has created. And this is the address that we send a request from Postman. So that is an important thing to remember. Then we are sending a request. In the request also, you can request applications to give you back data. So get is the default, as you can see, but you can also use it. You can also request other applications to, for example, to put data to a database. So with other methods, like we have get, put, post, patch, and delete. So with get, we are not sending data, but with other methods we send data. So we can use we have the different methods. You can see them in the drop down here. So add a breakpoint here, and for now I will meet you all until I finish this. Okay. So in here, request is sending a request to this flow. The same way we send a request from Postman to the same flow. It sends a request the same way that we send a request from Postman. So let me add a breakpoint here also. The other things that we are doing are the same. We want to understand the concept, I mean the mule event scope. So what we are doing is, where is it here? Move this up. Okay. So the path of this listener is get data request. Is this running? Get data request. Yeah, it should work. So I can send a request and show you. So we send a request to the main flow, or to the flow that is to the parent flow. The parent flow is upper flow, and that parent flow is requesting something from the flow below it. So I am sending a request, as you can see here. I'm sending a request. The request came to here. This should be in debug mode. So this is, I think, this is data from, okay, yeah. The request has come, as you can see here. I don't have any variable, I don't have any payload. As you can see, the payload media type is empty because I don't have any payload. Now click next. I created payload, which is the same thing, the JSON data. Now creating a variable of the payload, of the data type of the payload, which is application/JSON, just printing that to the console here. There is some error somewhere. It is saying, I'm not sure if it is related to this. So we have a request now. So request will come to the second, to the flow that is being requested. Click next. So now the listener got requested. So it is going to read a CSV data here. Let's see what came from the request to the flow that is being requested with get method. Payload now is empty, so the payload doesn't come. Variables also, we don't have any variables, as you can see. If we use flow reference, we say, since it acts as if it were part of the main flow, everything, the whole Mule event is accessible to the flow that is being called. Whereas with request, as you can see, the payload doesn't come with get method. We will see with other methods, by the way. If it is post method, since you are sending data, then the payload will have data. But variable, at least if there is no any variable. Now I will read data, the CSV data in the flow that is being requested. As you can see, I have CSV data now, payload. And it is this payload that comes to the request operation, because the request, I am sending request with get method. So I'm telling it to give me back data. This is a get method, as you can see, the default. So it is going to get this data, but it is not going to get any variables. The other thing is about the attributes we'll see in the second round. Let me finish this one first. Click next. Okay, this one will print the MIME type of this payload, which will be CSV. Click next. Now it has come to the calling flow. You see the calling flow now has a payload which came from the flow that was requested, and it is the CSV payload. Initially in here, our payload was JSON, but now the payload, the final payload is CSV, which came from this, from the request, in the request operation. The other thing is our original variable, it was not accessible to the flow that was requested, but at the end, in the main flow, it is available there. So you see, we have one variable, and that variable is MIME type main flow, which is this variable. So the variables that you had before the request operation in the main flow, you will get them after the request operation. The payload, it gets payload. If it is get method, it gets payload in the request operation. And also the attributes also, the other thing to remember here is attributes also, when we use request operation, it sends at the end, it will get its own attributes, like the status code you see here. If I go down here, status code 200 means the request operation worked fine. It got what it needed. So if you had attributes before the request operation, they will get overwritten by the request operation. If you had variables before the request operation, the variables, you will get them after the request operation. But the variables will not be accessible to the flow that is being called. So this is about requests. Before we move forward, I think I should take a couple of questions. Anyone has any questions about what we have seen so far? About using request operation? Okay, go ahead, please.
My question is, on this flow we see right now, the data we get from the airport, right? From the airport data, right?
Yeah.
My question is, in which flow do they communicate with the airport information here? For example, the JSON or CSV information we are processing in these flows. How do they communicate initially? With which one of the flows?
So, I mean, the airport data is data we have in our machine. In my case, for example, it is in this location. So we have some airport data, and we saved it in our machines as CSV, JSON, XML, and XLSX data formats for the purpose of this training. So I'm reading it in this from the file module. I'm using read operation, and it is reading the data here. This is in here it is reading CSV data. Here it is reading JSON data about airports. It is not actual. It is not getting live airport data from the internet. It is possible to get from the internet. We are going to see in the next one using request operation to request an external API. So we can request APIs about airports to give us data. But in this case, the data resides in our machine. And if you were not in the beginning, you can go to the, I have specified for those of you who also are kind of newcomers, if you go to the blog, data for the course is available here. You can get here in the blog. So if you click it here, it will take you to GitHub, and all the data sets that we are using so far are here. And down the line also other data sets that we will use, I will add them here. So this airport.csv.json and so on, they are in my computer. So I'm just reading it from this location. Did I answer your question?
Yes, Doctor. But second question, why is no breakpoint on the first logger?
No breakpoint on the first logger. You mean on the source in here?
Yeah, on the main flow and the private flow you do before, I guess. Yeah, there is no logger there, but there is logger on the private. There is.
Oh, okay. On the private. Okay, so you mean this one?
Yeah, there is log. Yeah, breakpoint here.
So the
we don't have.
Yeah. So the concept here is breakpoint. We add breakpointers to tell it to stop before executing that component until I click next. The stop there is what we are telling it when we run it in debug mode. So breakpointers we add it for debugging it. Debugging it means understanding what it is doing, how the data is flowing, what is changing, what is being created, when, and so on. Logger is just to print to the console. You can put as many as you want. I mean, just where you find them helpful. So in my case, for example, let me show with the request.
Yeah. Dr. I understand what logger means, but my question is, why no breakpoint on the first one, but there is breakpoint on the second one, on the private one?
There is a breakpoint on both of them. You can scroll up.
No. It is no on the first one. On the main flow, there is no breakpoint.
You mean this one? Okay, this one.
Yeah.
It should not matter. I mean, it should not matter with even you don't even need as many. You don't need to add breakpoints to every. You don't need to add breakpoint to every component. Only to the components where you want to see the meal event before moving further. You just add a breakpoint. Like here, for example, if I know here, I know it will create a payload. Here, I know it will create a variable, and I can just add a breakpoint just here and remove this breakpoint and this breakpoint. So by the time it reaches here, it is going to show me what it has done in the previous components. Yeah. Okay. Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Another question about the request operation. Henok, do you have a question? Okay, perfect. We can go to the next one. So what we said is request is like sending requests from Postman within your application. Exactly. Okay. And what we said, to reiterate here, it created the same address as URL as we send in Postman. Okay. And the other thing is when our request configuration is by default get, payload and variables, they don't get transferred from the flow that is requesting to the flow that is being requested. Whereas if it is, you can experiment with this. I think I can make that as an exercise. So in here, what it says is, I'll get back to this one. Let me make this full screen. Please experiment by changing the messages. So what it says here is, this is important. If the message is get, then payload is not sent to the request, to the flow that is being requested. because what we want is to get data, not to send data. So the payload is sent. Even if you have payload, the payload from the requesting flow doesn't get transferred to the flow that is being requested. However, if it is delete, patch, post, and put messages, then the payload from the requesting flow gets sent to the flow that is being requested. Like, for example, let me show you in this one, just at a high level to understand it. I have these queues. So we have these queues, and what it says is, I have data in a database. Starting next week, we are going to start learning about databases. What are databases? Why do we need them? How do we use them? It is very easy. The syntax is just like old English. But in databases, we store data. So we want to integrate MuleSoft with databases to read data from databases and also to get to send data to databases. So the request method, if we are using it to send data to the database, then it has to transfer the payload from the requesting flow to the flow that is being requested. In this case, for example, to insert it to this data, if this one is actually select, but if it is to insert it to that database, the payload has to be transferred. But if it is getting if the request default method we are using is the get method, then the payload doesn't get transferred to the flow that is being requested, is what that slide says. So to get back to that, so in here, let me increase this resolution brightness also. So if it is get method with request, it doesn't send the payload. It doesn't send variable also, whatever method it is, the variable from the main flow, from the requesting flow doesn't get sent to the flow that is being requested, we said. And about the attributes, we said since it is a request operation, it gets its own attributes. So the attributes that were there before the request operation get overwritten. You have new attributes. The variables, you have the variables that you had before the request operation from the main flow. You don't get back the variables from the flow that is being requested. However, the same as the flow reference also, the payload, you can save it as a target and get it as a variable in that case. So request here in the configuration, if you come here, go to advanced, target variable. So I can call this requested payload. Now my payload will not be overwritten. I will get it as a variable, the same as flow reference. Other things, I think, yeah, we are done. We can experiment with this one. Let me see if it updates. Okay, clear it here. Send another request. Now, oh yeah, it is here already. Now the payload from the flow that is being requested should come as a variable, is what we are saying. Let's check that. The variable also, you see, payload is empty, variable is empty. None of this gets transferred to the flow that is being requested. We said, now we are creating, reading data as CSV and creating another variable. That variable will not be accessible to the requesting flow. Now, if I come here, I have two variables. The two variables are, one is this one, the other one is the payload coming from the flow from the requested flow. So under here, if you see, requested payload is as a variable now, and it is CSV, the data type. And this variable is also the original variable before the request operation. So experiment with this. I think if you experiment it like this, I will understand it more. Okay, now let's experiment. Let's experiment by changing the method, by the way. So what we said is, if we change this method like to the rest of them, post, for example, it creates a new record. It is for creating a new record. So if it is post method, we are sending data. We know that by default. So it changes this to post. Then the payload from the requesting flow should come to the flow that is being requested. We will see the payload here in this case. So let me save this. Okay. Clear it. It seems it is updating. Okay. Clear this. So send. And what we said is, when it comes to the requested flow, then the payload from the original flow, we should see it here, because we are sending data to do something with that data, not getting data, but we are sending data in this case. So go here. So there is one variable. The variable will not be transferred, we said, only the payload. Okay. What is it saying? Read data. Oh, yeah. In that case, also, the other thing is, by the way, okay, I changed this to post.
Post.
And I have to change this one also to post. The listener in the second one, maybe it is get by default. Yeah, this one, since it is get. So the concept here is this flow. Initially, it was a listener, and the listener method was with get. So applications will trigger it to get data from it with get method. But if I try to trigger it with a post method, since it was explicitly only get, that is why it gave an error message. So I can remove this. If I remove it, the default is get and the post. So both ways it will work. But if I explicitly type one of them, I have to make sure they are consistent. If this is post, the request, if the request is method is post, then the flow that is being requested also has to be post. But I think a safer bet is just to leave this default so that it supports both get and post. So save this and maybe stop it and run it. Okay, I think it is good if we stop after we experiment with this one, so that we can continue tomorrow. I have a couple of other hands-on demos with request operation, but it is getting that. Okay, so send a request now. Comes here. Click next, next, next. Now request will send a post to the flow that is being requested. So the payload, the original payload, we will see it after it comes to here. However, this read CSV will overwrite it in this case. But at least we will see the original payload will come. That's what we are checking. Click next. See, the original payload is here. The original payload came from the flow that is requesting to the flow that is being requested. So this is, for example, if you have an application that writes data to some cloud data storage system, then using request, you can request it to insert your data to that data storage. You can think like that. So the payload, if the method in the request is all except, I mean, if it is put post-patch, then the payload also gets transferred to the flow that is being requested. So yeah, experiment with this, practice more, but tomorrow we'll continue with this one. We have a couple of more interesting practical hands-on examples. So please don't miss tomorrow's class. And also it is good if you experiment with it before the class. So to give you at a high level, tomorrow what we are going to see is about, so there are different publicly available APIs. Different APIs here. There are lots of APIs. We just want to experiment with a couple of them. Some of them need keys, but these 15 of them, it says free APIs you can use. One is here, top 15 free APIs without keys. That's what I'm using. And there are different APIs that you can experiment with here. I just took this one and this one, number 6 and number 7. So what they do is number 6, you give it a name and it predicts the gender of a person. Number 7, you give it a name and it gives you nationality. So let me close this and at a high level show you what it is doing. Stop this. Then we'll go in detail tomorrow. So see, it is very easy. There is a get method because I want to send a request to this application. That application, I want to send name as a query parameter, and the query parameter, I am saving it as a variable here. Then we have scatter gather. The scatter gather has 2 requests. One request, it requests this API, the genderized. The other one, the nationalized API. So we'll see how I'm specifying, how I'm passing dynamic query parameter here tomorrow. But anyway, I'm sending a request to both of them for the specified name in the query parameter. Then since we said scatter gather, it returns the mule events from the different routers as an object. I'm combining them here, creating this. We'll revise this tomorrow. But like if I run this now, you see we are using request to consume an external API or to integrate different APIs. So let me run it and quickly test with 1 or 2 names, for example. So here it is get data is a path, and come here. I said I want to send it as a query parameter. So name, for example, Desale. See if it knows it. Okay, this is deployed. Click send. What does it get? So it is 100% sure that the silent is from that country, probability 1, as you can see, and it says 98% confident that it is male. So it gets this prediction from the APIs. So I'm integrating APIs. You can integrate APIs this way. I can also test with another name. I'm not sure if it knows my name. Okay, knows it. Oh. 0.9999. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, we are going to see tomorrow in detail, try to understand the concept, what we are doing, how we pass the dynamic parameters. As you can see, we are passing, this is not hard-coded because the name changes. Since we are passing different name values, how is the name being incorporated into the request operation? There are ways to include dynamic headers, query parameters, and URI parameters in the request itself as what we do in Postman. So we want to discuss that in detail tomorrow, and we have more exercises. We will go over the hands-on queues, and also we will go over these questionnaires here. I have multiple questionnaires. If you understand the concept, it should be the same. And also I have a group work. So this one, we can discuss it tomorrow since we will have more time tomorrow, and we'll discuss other things also about the study groups and other things. But for today, I should not take more time than this, I think.
That's great.
Thank you.
Cool. Cool. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you so much, Doctor.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Dr.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.